Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to EWC Insights Asia Pacific Political Transitions. I am Panmin Yoking, a research fellow at the East-West Center, and I will be moderating today's session. Thank you for joining this event live, and thank you to those who are watching the recording. Our EWC Insights this afternoon features Dr. Victor Cha. Dr. Cha is currently a visiting fellow at the East-West Center and is a professor of government and vice dean at Georgetown University, where he holds the D.S. Song KF Professorship in Government and International Affairs. He is also Senior Vice President and Career Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He left the White House in 2007 after serving since 2004 as Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. At the White House, he was responsible for Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Island nation affairs. Dr. Cha was also the deputy head of delegations for the United States at the six-party talks in Beijing. He received 2 outstanding service commendations during his tenure at the NSC. He is the author of 5 books, including the award-winning Alignment Despite Antagonism, the United States, Korea, Japan Security Triangle, and The Impossible State, North Korea, Past and Future, which was selected by Foreign Affairs as a best book on the Asia Pacific for 2012. His newest book is entitled Power Play: Origins of the American Alliance System in Asia. And in 2018, he joined NBC and MSNBC as a news contributor. And prior to joining NBC, he has been a guest analyst for various media. Dr. Cha received his PhD in political science from Columbia University. And in today's session, Dr. Cha will discuss implications of US-China competition on allied choices. And before we start, just a brief note on the session's logistics. Dr. Cha's presentation will be approximately 40 minutes long. Then we will transition to a 20-minute Q&A session. To participate in the Q&A session, please submit your questions, comments, and suggestions in the Q&A box. And we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible. And just a quick announcement that the next speaker for this series of Asia Pacific political transitions will be Pittman Potter. And his talk will be focusing on China, COVID-19, and climate change. If you're interested in attending, his talk will be on November 17th at 2 p.m. And in the interest of time, I will end the introduction here and hand the stage over to Dr. Cha to start his presentation.
Thank you, Hanwen, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me? It's a pleasure to be with you all. Aloha. It's the evening here. I'm currently in Washington, D.C. It's the evening here. First, I want to thank the East-West Center. A big mahalo to the East-West Center for allowing me to be a visiting fellow to work on this project that I have been working on and off for a bit of time, between my duties at Georgetown and at CSIS. The East-West Center has given me the opportunity to be able to really think and put some time into this project, which is the core of my next book on alliances. And so what I'm going to do today, this afternoon, is give you a little bit of a taste of what I'm trying to do with this work, and then be happy to listen to any feedback, comments, complaints, questions that you have about it. So with that. Again, big thanks to the East-West Center, and let me get started here first by sharing my screen. Okay, and is that viewable to everybody? Funwin, can you see that? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, great. So the project is about alliance resilience in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. So in between, like, my writings on North Korea and policy issues, I've written sort of 3 more theoretical books. I've written 2 more theoretical books on alliances. The last one, as Panwin noted, was a theory about the creation of the US alliance system in Asia. And so this third book that I'm working on, about alliances, is about the whole question of alliance resilience, and in particular, alliance resilience more broadly, not just in Asia, but in Europe and Latin America, in the context of a new geostrategic environment for everybody, which is this new environment of US-China competition. So this is a quote by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, on March 12th of 2021, in which he said, as far as China is concerned, we are going to end up in a stiff competition with China, and we intend to prevail in that competition. And I start with this statement because it epitomizes the general turn to open strategic competition in relations between the United States and China. And this competition has dramatically changed the environment in which states must now operate. Governments around the world have to contend with what I call binary choices, or a binary choice, meaning that they face demands for allegiance by Beijing and by Washington on a range of security and economic issues. And so, that is the context in which I'm working on this project, because I'm trying to understand how states, in Asia primarily, but also in other parts of the world, contend with this situation of binary choices. According to the literature that's been written around this topic, there's been a debate for nearly 3 decades in international relations about how states deal with US-China competition. And to summarize what these debates boil down to, there are some that say the way countries respond is that they will link with the United States when faced with a binary choice. In other words, they will balance against the rising power, that being China. Others say that no, that's not what's going to happen, that what happens is that many states will de-link or decouple from the United States and accommodate China's rise. And then there's a third view that says it's neither balancing nor bandwagoning. What we'll see is a lot of hedging by countries as they're dealing with this competition between the United States and China. And again, there's a vast literature on this, and I'm not going to go into all of that. But that, in essence, is sort of what the literature has told us. In my project, I address this debate by looking at how allies and partners in Asia, Europe, and Latin America respond to Sino-US competition. And I reached 3 conclusions, which I'll give you up front. The first is that hedging which is often the preferred option, is no longer as feasible a strategy for states in this new era of US-China zero-sum competition. Facing cross pressures from Washington and Beijing, states have to make decisions that alienate one side or the other, much more so than they have in the past, right? Everything is relative. Policy choices are relative. And my point is that relative to the past in this environment, hedging is less feasible an alternative. Second, the primary determinant of what sort of choices countries make is whether the state sees itself as a shaper or a taker in the international system. And so what I mean by that is shapers will push back against Chinese binary choices, viewing their decisions as having longer-term significance for the rules-based liberal international order. Takers will accommodate China because they have less capacity to resist and because they do not internalize maintenance of the rules-based international order in their decision-making. Right? And then third, an important intervening variable in how states make decisions when faced with binary choices is the perceived reliability and resilience of US power. States that have confidence in the United States as a guardian of the rules-based order will be more inclined to resist binary choices imposed by China. and those that do not will be more inclined to accommodate China. So that is sort of the, if you will, the model or the theory that I'm trying to build on this. The main empirical finding of my work is that some, but not all key allies of the United States are quietly but persistently choosing to de-link from the United States and align with China. This de-linking trend is not a form of bandwagoning for profit, nor necessarily an accommodation of China's ascent to its historical place atop the Asian power hierarchy. Instead, it is a defensive reaction to the threat of Chinese economic retaliation, absent confidence in the resiliency of the patron ally. So I make this argument looking at 42 cases, binary choices in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. As I said earlier, a binary choice is defined as an issue where the target state has to contend with opposing positions demanded by the security patron and the economic patron. And so as you can see on the slide here, I look at 6 countries in particular: Australia, Brazil, Chile, Germany, Japan, and Korea. I'm probably going to add the Philippines also to the cases. I picked these countries because most of them are traditional military treaty allies of the United States. They play critical roles in the US-led security networks in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. In most cases, they share democratic values. But at the same time, their top trading partner is China. Right? And so for this, that's why I picked these countries. I find that in 21 of the 42 cases, the binary choice cases, states de-linked from the United States. In particular, 4 of the 6 states listed, Brazil, Chile, Germany, and South Korea, de-linked from the United States in the vast majority of cases, 19 of 23 cases. And on 18 of 42 cases, allies linked with the United States and opposed China. But this trend is really limited to 2 of the 6 US allies cited here, and that is Australia and Japan. This delinking from the US position in favor of China does not mean that US allies are abrogating the alliance contract. US allies are not yet abandoning core alliance equities like bases or troop deployments, excuse me, arms sales, military exercises, intelligence cooperation. They are not abandoning those things. And China, for the most part, is not challenging those staples of the alliance. Nevertheless, there's a definitive trend that serves China's strategy of gaining accommodation on a host of other political and military and economic issues, short of war, that do not actually trigger the military provisions of the mutual defense treaties that the United States has with these countries. And so that, you know, for those of you who are familiar with this sort of, these sorts of topics, you know, many other authors have surmised that there is about this tilt towards China that we're seeing among countries not just in Asia, but in Europe and other parts of the world as well. And so what I try to do in this project is I try to develop a theory to explain this, as well as build the empirical cases. There's a lot of speculation about how China's rise is affecting choices by allies, but most of the evidence tends to be pretty anecdotal and impressionistic. And so what I tried to do is build a model, which I'll show you very quickly in a second. And I try to build these case studies to offer data on this question of how allies are responding to US-China strategic competition. So with that, let me talk a little bit about the argument. Again, I'm conscious of not getting too much into the weeds of this. So But let me just try to explain my rationale for how I think these the relationship between identity and choices that states make work. So, nation states in the international system generally encounter binary choices in periods of great power competition, when you have a hegemon and you have a rising power, each of whom are demanding allegiance. The hegemon seeks decisions by other states that maintain the order, while the rising power imposes binary choices that generally seek to change the existing order. And this is a generalization, but the substance of these choices generally relate to three contested elements of the international order. That is, one, the competition for territory; two, the rules of the order; and three, who holds political authority. How a country responds to these cross pressures, right? Because you have the United States and China, the hegemon and the rising power, putting cross pressures on these third parties. How a country responds to cross pressures from a patron ally and a rising power is a function of both internal and external factors. And I argue that the primary determinant of choice is whether the state is what I call a shaper or a taker in international affairs. Most states, if left to their own devices, will act like myopic, self-interested actors who will not consider how their actions affect the broader order. But shapers internalize the health and success of the regional order as a responsibility. They choose policies based on self-interest, but are also informed by a sense of ownership for consolidating, protecting, and maintaining the rules-based order. Takers, by contrast, make choices that are informed by short-term self-interest and only short-term self-interest. It's not that takers don't care about the consequences of their choices in the order. I think many of them do, but many of them, I think, see the external environment as a given or as structural, and they therefore don't think that their choices matter. They don't think their choices actually affect the international order, while shapers believe that their choices do aggregate to affect changes in the international order. So again, one of the hypotheses, key hypotheses of the work is the first one on the slide. If a state identifies as a shaper in an international system, it will make binary choices that support the rules-based order. And hypothesis two, if a state identifies as a taker in the international system, it will not make binary choices that support the rules-based order. Decisions that are made by takers manifest a resignation to accept the world as it is. You know, they have no choice. They have to accept the world as it is. They have to accept the choices that are being imposed on them as it is, while shapers really choose to try to preserve the order as it should be. While a shaper will reflexively resist choices that potentially erode the rules-based order, a taker will not be so reflexive, either because he can't bear the cost of the choice, or, as I said earlier, it just doesn't feel like its actions can substantially sustain or damage the order. So as I said, there are many determinants of what makes a state a shaper of a taker or taker in the international system. I listed a few things here: relative size, the degree to which common values are shared with the hegemon. Geography is important. Geography, proximity is important. A normative belief in the order, whether it believes that the existing order is a good in and of itself. And then conception of the alliance generally refers to what extent do these alliance partners see the alliance as a bigger political institution standing for more than simply I'm not simply, but more than national security. The second determinant of binary choice is the resiliency and dependency of the patron ally. And this is the third proposition on the slide here. If the patron ally is seen as a guardian of the order, then this will affect the binary choices of both the shapers and the takers. So just to elaborate on this, when faced with binary choice pressures, states will respond differently depending on whether or not the patron ally is seen as a dependable guardian of the order. If states see the patron ally as a steward of the order, then they'll be more willing to defend that order. But if they do not perceive the guardian to be there to defend the order, then states experience less compunction to preserve the order when they're faced with these binary choices, because they would effectively be facing them alone rather than with the help of others. So all of this leads to a model, a binary choice model, a very simple 2x2, where if you, so you can see here, this is whether the country is a shaper or the country is a taker. This is the perception of the United States as the guardian of the order or not a guardian of the order. And I would just draw your attention to quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. The point being that if a country identifies itself as a shaper of the international order and it sees the United States as a guardian of the order, then it's more likely to resist pressure from China and link with the patron ally, right, the United States. On the other hand, here, if a country identifies itself as a taker and it does not see the United States as a reliable defender or guardian of the order, then it is much more likely to be unable or unwilling to resist choices put upon them by China, and is more likely to de-link from the patron ally, right? So I draw your attention to 1 and 4 because those are the two extreme propositions that emerge from the model. Okay. Just looking at time here. So I apply this model to 6 countries, as I said: Australia, Brazil, Chile, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. Again, I choose these 6 countries because they are close security partners of the United States and close economic partners of China. The first thing I do is identify whether these countries are shapers or takers in the international order. So as you can see here, if we start with Australia, Australia, it's not a large country, but it does share values with the hegemon, a long relationship with the hegemon, a special relationship in terms of conception of the alliance, but still heavily dependent on China economically. So they're kind of a hybrid. There's a little bit of a shaper identity, but also a little bit of a taker identity. Brazil and Chile, I largely see them as being takers in the international system. They might be less of takers in their region, but when we look at Asia in particular, they're much more takers. They're not so focused on maintaining any particular order in Asia. Germany is a very interesting case because there's no denying globally that it's a shaper in international affairs, given its size. Given its size, given the size of its economy, given its role in the EU, it's clearly a shaper. But in Asia, arguably in Asia, it is more of a taker because it really doesn't appear to, and we can talk about this when we get to the cases, until fairly recently, doesn't really appear to have deep stakes in maintaining of the order or elements of the rules-based order when it comes to Asia. Japan is a shaper based on geography, based on size, based on values, alliance relationship with the United States. And Korea is another interesting case because it's a hybrid. It's somewhere between a taker and a shaper, heavily reliant on China in terms of its economy and trade, but at the same time, a very deep security tie with the United States, common values, things of that nature. But as I mentioned earlier here, the identity of the state is only one element of this. The other is their view of the relationship, their view of the patron ally. And so, whether they're a shaper or taker is one thing, but then what their view of the ally is another important variable. And it's based on this combination that we make predictions about what these countries will do when faced with binary choices imposed by the United States and by China. And so you can see here, the prediction for Australia is that for the most part, they will, because they view the United States as present as the guardian of the order. There's a likelihood that they will link more than they will hedge, or than they will delink. In the cases of the two Latin American countries, they're both takers, and they don't really see the United States as a guardian of the order. So the prediction is that when faced with binary choices between the United States and China, they will delink from the United States. In the case of Germany, it's a hybrid, both a shaper and a taker, but arguably, and the period of time is 2013 to 2020 for this particular project. They don't really see the United States as a guardian, so they will delink. Japan is a shaper, very strong, invests in the United States as a very strong guardian of the order, so they will link with the United States. And in the case of Korea, they're hybrid, taker, shaper. They do believe in the United States as a guardian of the order, but it's still fairly weak. They will, the prediction here is they will delink from the United States more than they will hedge. And I should just add here that, again, when we talk about view of the patron ally, the period of time that I'm covering with this is 2013 to 2020. And so I just want to make a couple of comments. First, during the Trump years, Trump's proclamations of America First, his open disdain for the U.S. policeman role in the world, all of this generated widespread concerns about America's withdrawal from the world stage. Many allied leaders in these countries could discount the personal insults, but they recognized the actions. Right? Refusal to reaffirm Article 5 of NATO, troop cuts in Germany, disengagement from Iraq and Afghanistan, troop pullouts from northern Syria, canceled military exercises with South Korea, cost plus demands for burden sharing with South Korea, Japan, and Germany, withdrawal from TPP, the WHO, the climate accords, non-WTO compliant trade actions, stoking of anti-globalism, coddling of dictators in North Korea and Russia. All of this aggregate to wholesale U.S. abdication of its role as a guardian of the liberal order. You could not do more things to demonstrate the abdication of its role as guardian of the order. But as I said, this covers not just Trump, but before Trump. And here, the argument is that even before Trump, there was some sapping confidence in the U.S. as a guardian of the order, but that derived less from political will, which you could argue was what was being demonstrated by Trump, the political will to disengage, and more from declining capabilities. The embroilment in two wars in the Middle East and Central America, depleting resources and taking away high-level attention to other foreign policy priorities. The 2008 global financial crisis, which reduced U.S. share of the global economy, while China's share remained relatively unscathed. And then third, sequestration of defense budgets meant declining military resources on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decade. So as much as Obama's pivot to Asia was welcomed, regional partners viewed it as poorly resourced, too focused on the military dimension rather than a comprehensive strategy for Asia. The exception to this perception of US unreliability among the cases, as I noted earlier, was Japan and Australia. Both allies continued to believe and invest in the US as a guardian of the order during these years. And even when US policies were lacking, Australia and Japan brought their own diplomatic and military assets to resource the policy rather than hedging. They sought to actually double down on the relationship with the United States and invest in the United States as a guardian, as the guardian of the order. Okay, so I'm just going to show you quickly. So these are the cases, as I said: Australia, Latin America, Europe, Japan, Korea. I won't go through all these. Let me just take you through. Let me just take you through Australia and South Korea, because I think that'll then take me right to time. So here, this is the case of Australia. We have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. So there were 10 binary choice cases that I could find during this time period. Again, cases where the United States had one view on the issue and China had a different view. And this is how I code South Korean, Australian policy choices. On the ADIZ, declaration of the ADIZ, they linked with the United States, the Huawei, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, Blue Dot Network, Economic Prosperity Network, Hong Kong, and COVID. In all of these cases, arguably the US and China had different positions. They communicated these positions to the Australians, and the choices that the Australians made were clearly weighted in the direction of linking with the United States. The two exceptions to this are listed here. One was AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, where Australia was asked to join the bank. United States, the Obama administration discouraged countries from joining the bank, and Australia made the decision to join. And the hedge is the Belt and Road Initiative, where at the federal level, at the broader government level, there was a great deal of ambivalence and concern about BRI, transparency of projects, things of that nature. But local governments, in particular the government of Victoria, did sign on to BRI projects. The updating of this would be, I mean, as some of you know, since then, the Morrison government has actually overruled the Victorian government on this. So this is coded as a hedge, but it actually might move in the direction of linking with the United States. So again, as per the model that I showed you earlier, Australia is a country that sees itself as a shaper and also is investing in the United States as a guardian of the order. It is predicted to link with the United States more than de-link when faced with these binary choices. And again, in the cases that I could find, it does in fact appear to be the case that Australia is linking more with the United States than de-linking when faced with these binary choices. They're suffering because of that, as we all know, because China has been imposing a lot of costs on Australia. But you know, this is, for the purposes at least of this work, this is what you would expect to see given the two variables that I've talked about. Latin America, as I said, there are not that many cases of binary choices. They're primarily economic ones: BRI, AIIB, and Huawei. And on all of these cases, very clearly expressed positions by the United States, very clearly expressed positions by China. You know, in my research and work, I try to document and show how both Beijing and Washington were actively lobbying for their position to be the one taken by these countries. In the case of Huawei, Trump personally, in his first summit meeting with Bolsonaro, said, "Don't allow Huawei into your 5G auction." And in all these cases, the decision was made by these countries to de-link from the United States. Germany, again, I found 7 cases with regard to Germany on this, and there you can see how it all panned out. CFIUS refers to that is one case of linking with the United States, and that refers to attempts by Chinese companies to buy German technology companies. German technology companies, which the United States put under CFIUS review, Treasury Department CFIUS review, because the components that the target company, German company made were also used in U.S. weapon system, and the United States actually said that the sale should not go through, and Germany agreed with that. So that's the one case of linking with the United States, but the others, AIB, South China Sea, Huawei, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, they tended to de-link from the United States. And I mean, we can go into the details of that in the question and answer, but that's Germany. Japan, it's a shaper, right? Strongly supportive and invested in the United States as a guardian of the order. So we would expect that then when faced with binary choices, they will link with the United States. And that's in fact what we see on all these cases. The ADIS in East China Sea, AIIB, South China Sea, BRI, Huawei, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, Blue Dot Network, Economic Prosperity Network. On Hong Kong, it's coded as a hedge, because while Japan did express concern about the national security law imposition in Hong Kong, it did not levy sanctions, and so that's why it's a hedge. And then the last case is Korea. Again, this is a case which is a hybrid, a shaper and a taker, but obviously has a lot of equities with China. And here the prediction is that they would de-link. And this is probably one of the more interesting cases because it's a very close treaty ally of the United States. But if you look at the cases of binary choices, there's a lot of de-linking going on here, a lot more than one might have expected. Okay, so the implications of all this, let me just take you through very quickly. So the first is that, as I mentioned earlier, in this zero-sum competition environment that these countries face between the United States and China, there's very little room to hedge, much less room than there was in the past to hedge. And so empirically, when we look at the cases, these 42 cases of binary choices, there are only 3 instances in which hedging took place. It was otherwise very difficult for these countries to hedge. So, so I think that is something that has been that is true when we look at the data. Second point is about gray zone coercion. When I've talked about this, when I've in other fora, the question that I always get is that the argument that there may be potential erosion of U.S. alliances in Asia based on these cases is spurious because the substance of these binary choices are minor and do not hit at the core of the alliance contract. In other words, core of the alliance contract, I mean things like security commitments, basing, intelligence cooperation, troop deployments, joint military exercises. In other words, allies may accept Chinese invitations to join a bank like AIIB, but they will not defer to Chinese demands to expel US military bases. And I think that's true. I think that's an accurate observation. But I would argue that it downplays the significance of these purportedly minor choices. Most of these Chinese imposed binary choices reside in a gray zone that do not trigger US treaty commitments to its allies outright, but in aggregate, they cast influence over these countries slowly and quietly. This is what some recent authors have described as competitive coercion, which is an attempt to slowly undermine the US alliance system without firing a shot in order to clear its path to setting China's rules as the regional hegemon. So in that sense, these binary choice outcomes are significant because even though they're minor, they aggregate in a way that is significant for the resiliency of the American alliance system and the rules-based order. Running out of time, so I'm not going to go into alternative explanations. Counter to realism. So again, this work runs contrary to the dominant realist prediction that China's rise would elicit counterbalancing coalitions by states in the international system. People like John Mearsheimer and others have said that that's what would happen, but that's not what's happening. It also runs counter to the literature that predicts countries will increase hedging between the two competing great powers. There's a lot of literature, particularly in Southeast Asia, that says that means there's going to be more hedging the more competition there is. But as I showed, that's very hard to do. And third, the absence of balancing by these secondary powers is not a form of a hierarchical accommodation of China. The argument that people like David Kang, my good friend David Kang makes. But I argue it's the result of the taker status, right? The identity they take on as takers and the lack of confidence in the United States as the guardian of the order. So what are the policy implications for this? There are five very quick ones. The first is this binary choice model draws attention to mistaken attribution, or I should say mistaken attribution when it comes to viewing alliance disloyalty. So what does that mean? It means that basically the high defection rate of US allies might be interpreted in Washington as dispositional, that is reflecting a fundamental strategic shift by states away from the United States and towards China. And this might create confidence in China that it is successfully peeling off US allies. It might lead it to take overzealous actions. And so what this study suggests is that the delinking behavior by US partners may be situational rather than dispositional, right? In other words, it is not a fundamental core choice that states have made, but it's related much more to allies' perceptions of their predicament rather than a fundamental change in strategy, right? Related to the situation of lack of confidence in the United States and their inability to see themselves as shapers. And so in a sense, that's the good news story. If there is alliance defection taking place, it may not necessarily reflect a fundamental change in strategy, dispositional, but it may reflect the situation. That leads to the second point. This study suggests the importance of reputation in alliance politics in two respects. The first is how willing states are to identify as a shaper in US-China competition may be a function not just of how much these states care about the order, but how much they care about being seen as standing up for the rules-based order. And if they value that reputation as being seen as standing up for the order, that's going to be important in terms of determining how much more willing they are to make the difficult choices. And then third, related to reputation is the importance of US staying power. A state's propensity to stand up to Chinese bullying is directly a function of the reputation of the guardian and its staying power. Here, words matter as much as actions. And so negative comments about allies, positive comments about adversaries, silence with regard to supporting democratic values and freedom around the world have a real cost, even if security commitments remain intact. And in fact, presence of the United States as a guardian could also have a feedback effect. It could turn shapers into takers in the international system. The fourth point, something that's actually very appropriate given what we're seeing what we're seeing the Biden administration doing today. Working in coalitions, in groups, can also turn takers into shapers. It's much easier to deal with China as a group than it is to deal with China alone. It's much easier to see oneself as a shaper when you're dealing with China as a group than you are when you're dealing with China alone. And then finally, the last point is in terms of strategy. The US-China competition is driven by many things. It's driven by Taiwan, it's driven by supply chains, it's driven by strategic competition, all these things. But if anything, what this argument says is that another cost that needs to be calculated into our strategy vis-a-vis China is, how this competition is affecting choices that allies make. Because if we think we're winning the competition on supply chains, but at the same time, our allies are quietly making choices that are accommodating China more than they are not, then that's a liability in the cost-benefit ledger that we need to be paying attention to. And so that, I think I've gone beyond time, Panwin. So on that, let me stop. Thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Cha, for the very informative presentation. It reminds me a lot about the binary choice, reminds me of the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. But we have a lot of questions for you from the audience. And the first question that I will ask is a clarification question from the audience, and that is, how do you define rule-based order?
So that I have it written down here, but I can't find it. And I define the rules-based order largely as the post-war liberal international rules-based order. So the post 1945 liberal rules-based international order. I should say that in my definition of countries that see themselves as shapers don't only want to simply maintain the order as it is now. Shapers are open to change in the order, whether it's the regional order or the international order. But that change should be transparent. It should be by consensus. It should not be by fiat, or it should not be by coercion. So the order is largely identified as the one having to do with the post-45 rule-based liberal international order. Shapers want to maintain that order, but they are not against change in that order, as long as that change is coming through consensus, transparent, consistent rules, and not by fiat, not by coercion. So.
Got it. Okay, the next question pertains to South Korea and Japan. And that is, what are the prospects for a more constructive relationship between South Korea and Japan?
The relationship is about as bad as it's ever been right now, I think. That is, it is important for thinking about the question of coalitional diplomacy in Asia, because Japan, the United States, Australia, India, and others are greatly engaged in this coalitional diplomacy, but Korea is not. It has kind of separated itself from that. And that is related to Korea-Japan relations because Japan is central in all of these coalitional efforts, a central player in all these coalitional efforts. So the point of this is to say that the current dysfunction in Japan-Korea relations has costs for both sides, not just bilaterally, but also regionally and in terms of these broader coalitions. Whether there can be improvement anytime soon, it's very hard to say. I mean, there's a new government in Japan, and I think that's important. There'll be a new government in Korea after the elections next March. Sometimes that's what it takes. It takes a new beginning before we can actually see any progress or an attempt at progress going forward. I don't think that we'll see a new agreement. Like, part of the way this started to come apart was over the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. I can't imagine that there'll be another agreement at this point. It'll be a challenge for policymakers to try to figure out how to find a path forward. But having said that, there is more trilateral dialogue taking place among Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. I mean, there was actually trilateral dialogue taking place this week in DC over North Korea. And so I think there's still opportunities to continue to talk there very practically and pragmatically. And so that might provide a good platform. I think Blinken also, when he was Deputy Secretary of State, did these quarterly trilateral meetings with the United States, Japan, and South Korea. And so I think he's internalized the importance of trilateral cooperation. Wendy Sherman is trying to do the same, to hold these trilateral meetings every quarter. And so that's, I think, another positive sign. But to see real change at the leadership level, I think we'll have to wait until we get two new leaders in both countries.
Got it. Okay. The next question we have is, if hedging by the third-party states is becoming less feasible, is it more China or more the USA that is forcing them to take one side?
So that's a really good question. And part of the reason why I chose this period from 2013 to 2020 is that arguably before then, the United States was not really imposing binary choices on its allies and partners. In fact, I have in the paper that I'm writing on this, it was almost a truism for Asia hands in the State Department to say that if US policy ever says to countries, you have to choose between China and the United States, that by definition would be a failure. That's bad policy. Right? It would be a failure of US policy if we pushed countries into the corner to make those choices. That was sort of the accepted conventional wisdom of what was good and bad policy when it came to Asia. That was not the case for China. China has always imposed binary choices, whether it's on Taiwan or, they've always imposed binary choices on countries in Northeast Asia and in Southeast Asia. And so it was, before it was easier for countries to hedge because only one side was really imposing binary choices and the other was deliberately trying to avoid binary choices. So there was more room to hedge. And so the argument now is really starting from 2013, as the United States starts disposing of the responsible stakeholder template when it comes to dealing with China, saying that that has basically not succeeded and that we need to take a more competitive position. Then we start to see both sides imposing more binary choices. And that's why this has become more relevant a question today. I mean, I'm trying to look at this in a more theoretical context, but look at every policy journal or a blog or newspaper article on almost any country that's dealing with the United States and China. And this is the constant question that always comes up. Like when I do my research for this and I read about Germany or Japan or South Korea, the Philippines, you can write the headlines and just plug in the name, like Germany squeezed between the United States and China, South Korea squeezed between the United States and China. These sorts of things only started to emerge after the United States started moving to this more competitive position, because then both hegemons were now imposing choices on these countries.
Got it. Okay. The next question we have is, and we have only 3 minutes left, and I'm going to try and squeeze in 3 questions. So the question is, how does China's economic leverage over the USA and most of other states in the region affect balancing and bandwagoning dynamics?
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick with my answer. So the quick answer to that is, that's a great question. And that's exactly what I'm trying to understand with this project is, under what conditions does Chinese economic leverage work in terms of getting countries to do what they want, and under what conditions does it not? And, my answer is that it's partially about the economic leverage, but it's partially about the identities that these countries take and the extent to which they see the United States as present or not. That will determine the extent to which Chinese economic leverage will be successful in creating, bandwagoning or balancing behavior.
Okay, another question is, are there any governments rejecting the binary choice mentality and promoting the collaboration between China and the US?
Yeah, I think many countries in Southeast Asia are trying to do that, trying to do exactly that. In fact, most of the literature about hedging, about not making choices, comes from Southeast Asia and comes from middle powers like Australia and South Korea, or Australian authors and South Korean authors. But as we're seeing, there's a big gap between the empirical reality of what's happening and what these authors are writing. Australia is not hedging, right? They are very clearly making a choice. They're paying a tremendous cost, but they're clearly making a choice. And I'm trying to develop an explanation for why, for why they're doing that. South Korea too, it looks like has made a choice, but in the opposite direction that Australia is making a choice. When they're both treaty allies of the United States, when they're both middle powers, right? And so, how do you explain that? Like, that's a puzzle. And so I'm trying to develop a theory to explain those variations.
Okay, let's focus on Australia. And this is just a comment, a statement. A lot of opposition in Australia is about nuclear submarines and US bases, worried about being dragged into a war and US based in Australia being sacrificed. Would you have any response to this statement?
So I would say there that I think in general, whenever there are changes that are made to the alliance relationship, and I think we're going to see, we may see more of that as the United States ramps up coalitional diplomacy. AUKUS is one example, but there are others as well. It's natural that there will be some what we call entrapment fears, right? Concerns by some that this is pulling the country into a potential conflict. But we don't. Hello?
Yes, I can see.
Yeah. Okay. But we. So I think that is. That's funny. All of a sudden, my Microsoft Teams turned on. So I think those entrapment fears are natural, but I think the other way to look at it is things like AUKUS are not meant to start a war with China; they're meant to deter one, to create a balance of power that deters potential action by countries in the region.
Okay, I'm gonna squeeze in one more question, and we're gonna move on to Germany. Under what kind of situations might Germany and Korea relink with the US?
So, again, I think certainly some of it has to do with leadership. But, to go back to the model, my model would say, one, when they gain more confidence that the United States is a resilient and permanent guardian of the order, that will then potentially make them more interested in acting like a shaper rather than a taker in the international system. So I think that's one. The other is peer pressure, right? So in the case of Germany, there's been a lot of pressure from other EU countries that Germany is being acting too much like a taker, right? Not really criticizing on Xinjiang, allowing their companies to continue to operate, right? Not willing to criticize on Hong Kong or put sanctions with regard to Hong Kong. Criticized for not saying anything about what's happening in the South China Sea. So Germany has responded to that fairly recently, and has been involved in FONOPs and has been more willing to criticize China on the origins of COVID is another one. So again, part of it is, I think, is resilience perception of the United States, and I think that's changing with the Biden administration. The Biden administration has done a lot more to give confidence, and then the other is peer pressure from other countries, other neighboring countries.
Got it. I know we have a lot of questions left, but unfortunately we have to end here. Thank you very much, Dr. Cha, for sharing your findings, and to all our audience and participants for joining us this afternoon. And I invite you to join our next EWC Insights on November 17th for a talk by Pittman Potter. Until then, have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.